Hi guys, and welcome to the course. This is our first lecture, so we're going to be talking about motivation. This is kind of the introduction to the study of motivation. It gives us an overview. A couple things that we can consider is first, this lecture is available to you in its original PowerPoint format on Carmen. So if you think you need to furiously take notes as I'm speaking, and I know, who am I kidding? But if that's kind of your approach, remember that you have this available to you in that manner. The lectures will be linked through Carmen to YouTube. I keep them on YouTube. I don't want to keep them on OSU serviced areas, because then there might be a question about who owns the lecture, and this is something I ran into at Columbus State when I was there. So I keep it on YouTube because this is my stuff that I share with you, and I'm going to retain ownership of it one way or another. So I'm an amateur photographer. When I was in high school, I wanted to become a photographer. I applied to Brooks Institute of Photography coming out of high school in Santa Barbara, California, but my grade point average sucked. I had a 2.7 GPA in high school, so let's just say that colleges, etc., weren't falling over themselves to admit me. Brooks didn't accept me, and that set me off on a long path of doing other things besides education. So that's that story. But so occasionally I'll put my own photographs in the lectures, more so in other classes probably than this one. But let's begin. Hello, Hannah. So one thing you probably see a lot of cats come by and check out what's going on, especially this week because we haven't done this in a couple weeks, so they want to know, what's strange and what's going on here. So let's talk about motivation. Also, one more thing I wanted to say was the homework assignments, I also embed them into the lectures. So homework assignments are tied to the lecture, and they will be presented, and I talk about them in the lecture. And of course, the assignments are posted on Carmen in the appropriate module. So let's talk about motivation. And motivation really does two things. It's the process that gives behavior its energy and its direction, right? And this is a simple working definition that we can use. Although motivation, the deeper we get into it, we see that the more varied the definitions of motivation might be depending on who you're talking to. But as kind of an overview, this is a pretty simple definition. So energy and direction, and simple idea, right? So the energy is behavior is relatively strong, intense, and persistence would indicate maybe a high level of motivation. And you know, I'm big on measurement. I came out of OSU social psychology, and we're all about measurement. We're all about methods. We're all about experimental research, insanely so. So if we want to assess the level of someone's motivation in the laboratory, what we might do then is set up situations where we see how strong is the behavior, how intense or how persistent is someone in a behavior. And these might then be indicators of their motivational level. And then the direction is kind of a simple concept, right? What we're talking about here is behaviors aimed towards achieving a particular purpose or goal. So between the two, and you can see that if a low level of motivation, then the goal likely might not be accomplished. Okay? So motivational science then, what do we look at? Well, you know, we talk about theory, and a lot of people say, oh, well, that's just a theory. Oh boy, you don't want to say that to an experimental social psychologist of anyone. No, it's not just a theory. A theory is at the center of all knowledge, right? The theory is what drives us. It's what organizes our thinking and allows us to develop a myriad of hypotheses that are testable. Now, reality and theory, though, are not necessarily always aligned, and this is the beautiful thing about science, because we're always discovering new ideas. We're always getting another view on what constitutes reality. Now, the theory, as I said, generates hypotheses, and hypotheses are important because we can go and take them into the laboratory and we can test the hypotheses. So, from the hypotheses, we generate data, right? And this really then allows us to support or begin to refute the theory. Now, one thing I learned early on in my methods classes is we never prove a theory. We can provide evidence that supports a theory, or we can provide evidence that refutes a theory. But proof is something for geometry. If you remember geometry, you had to, prove that this is a frickin' hypotenuse or some such nonsense. I slept through most of geometry in high school. I will admit it. It was after lunch, so I was not a great student back then, let me put it that way. But the data then, and this is where statistics comes in, because statistics allows us to make sense of the data, right? Data then provides us for support for the theory or not. And then, if we're thinking in terms of applied science, the application, right, is based on data generated by hypotheses that supports a theory. And this is how then we begin to take what we've learned into the real world and use it in some manner. Right, Hannah? All right. So, important slide here. One of the most important slides that we're going to have in the entire course. Let's get it up front. The idea here is that there are multiple motivations. If we say, oh, what motivated them to do that, it shouldn't be what motivated them to do that as looking for a single answer. Critical thinking says, when I ask the question, what motivated to do them, it's like, okay, develop a list of their possible motivations. So maybe there's 5 or 6 possible motivations that will work that would explain, at least in part, the behavior we observed. And notice, that's what psychological science is explaining observed behavior. Once we can verify our explanations over time, then we can begin to predict behavior. But explanation, so I observe a behavior and I say, well, why the hell did they do that? Why did they do it? Look, yesterday was a pretty big day in the United States. January 6, 2001. We had a couple thousand people march on the Capitol, break into the Capitol, commit federal crimes. Why did those people do that? And to think that there's a single reason, a single motivational explanation for thousands of people participating together in a federal crime, insurrection against the United States, traitorous activity. If we think there's a single explanation, we're operating from a position of being relatively simple-minded. There's multiple explanations. 1,000 individuals, 2,000 individuals, whatever it is, break into the Capitol building, and we ask, why did they do that? What motivated them to behave that way? Well, there's going to be a long list of explanations. Now, the critical thinking part is, once I have a long list, I say, why did that person do that? And I generate, let's say, 6 or 8 possible reasons. Now, I begin to look at evidence. Some evidence will support some of the reasons. Other evidence will point to, that's probably not a good explanation. The evidence doesn't support it. Thing is, there might be multiple explanations for a single person's behavior. There might be several reasons why they engaged in such a heinous activity, right? So let's look, for example, let's ask the question, why exercise? How many of you exercise? And I'm going to bet there's about 1/3 of you who exercise on a regular basis, and do so with little struggle in forcing yourself to do so. There's another 1/3 of you that exercise sometimes, maybe sometimes not, and there's another 1/3 that don't exercise at all. Now, some people think they should exercise, but can't seem to manage to make themselves do it. Other people seem to do it freely, and the people who are not interested, right, we probably don't need to have them in this discussion because it's not pertinent at that point. But why exercise? Well, some people might exercise because they're intrinsically motivated. That is, the motivation comes internally. They find it fun. They like to do it, so they exercise, right? And children exercise spontaneously. They play, they run, they do all that kind of stuff, right? But some of us on our own. What is our idea of fun? Hey, a pickup basketball game, right, outside the dorm. Okay. Now, some people exercise because it's a personal challenge, and there's something in that person that likes to engage in a personal challenge. Now, for example, I got a little extra poundage on me, and it got pretty bad there, so I have been exercising. And my preferred exercise, what do I like to do? I like to lift weights, right? But lifting weights, going to the gym isn't really on the table right now, but we do have a Bowflex downstairs, and I use the Bowflex, and I use it 5-6 times a week. Why? Well, weightlifting has a strong appeal to me. I picked up the habit when I was an undergrad, I know, at 40 years old or whatever, and I used to go to the gym 3 times a week in Southern California, 4 times a week, run on the off days, just to get a little aerobic in. But one thing I love about weightlifting is it shows me improvement, personal challenge. So if, when I first started weightlifting back in the day, I could bench press, maybe 120 pounds without causing myself excess pain. After 2 years, I could bench press about 210. Now, I'm not talking big numbers, and you guys, you gym rats, that ain't anything. But for me, what it showed was personal accomplishment. Another thing, this flow that Csikszentmihalyi talks about, he coined the term flow, is that you get into the zone. And I know for many of you run, you play, you lose yourself, time seems to stand still as you're engaged in this activity. Once you experience that sense of flow, then it probably you want to experience it again. For some reason, somehow it's appealing. Interestingly, one of the places that I experience flow to the greatest extent is when I'm in the classroom lecturing. Not so much like this, because I don't get any feedback. I really miss being in a room with you guys. We share that room, we share that energy, we share the space. I started out by doing the lecture, etc., but then you interrupt, you ask questions, and then that guides me through the rest of the lecture in my ad-libbing and how the lecture moves, etc. And when it's a really good lecture, man, I look up at the clock and time is almost done. And it doesn't feel like any time has passed at all. That would be indicative of a state of flow. Other reasons? Well, maybe you're forced to do so. Those of you who are in the military, if you remember boot camp or whatever it was, right? Maybe you didn't want to exercise, but you were forced to do it. The people said you're going to do this or else, right? Maybe you're paid to do so. So we can go down the list. I'm not going to talk about each one, but look at these on your own time, right? And you can see that these are all legitimate reasons for why someone might exercise. Now, to know why they actually exercise, pick out maybe 4 or 5 the most likely, and then figure out some way to gather the evidence that either supports or refutes the ones you've chosen, and you'll get a pretty clear picture of why someone is doing what they're doing. So, 2 perennial questions. What do we know? Well, 2 perennial questions of motivation. What causes behavior? To me, this is what drove me to be a social psychologist when I was 15 years old. I'm like, why do they do that? Why did they do that? Why did they do that? It was one of my favorite questions. It always popped to mind. It made me want to become a social psychologist or a photographer, take your pick. But what causes behavior? Okay. Why did she do that? Or why, if you want to look at it internally, and that's, one of the most fascinating things, and I hope that we add to this, is the story of you. And in part this class is the story of you. Why did I do that, right? Why do people do what they do, right? And then the other question is, why does behavior vary in its intensity? Why do people try so hard, and why do others give up almost instantaneously, right? So why do we then maybe perhaps behave one way in a given situation, and yet behave in a different way in a different situation? Or why do you devote more energy to one class more so than you might devote to another class? And we can look at it in the academic context. Why are motivational differences among individuals, and how do such differences arise? So where does that come from? Now that's maybe a little more difficult question to answer, a little more complicated. What causes behavior is probably simpler in its initial statement. So specific questions then that constitute the core problems to be solved in the study of motivation. What starts behavior? What initiates behavior, right? How is behavior sustained over time? What makes people persist or not, right? Why is behavior directed towards some ends but away from others? Okay. Why does behavior change its direction? And then finally, why does behavior stop? And that is often a neglected question that I think is fascinating. There's a lot of attitude researchers that were interested in this. Also people who look at judgment and decision making. How do I decide, when I come to a decision point, how do I decide that I've thought about it enough and now I'm prepared to make a decision? So that would be a very cognitive kind of elaboration on that question. So, the subject matter motivation concerns processes, right, which give behaviors energy and direction. Remember, energy and direction. And think about it, when we look at the quiz, right, in the quizzes, right, it's open book, open note, 20 questions, 120 minutes, so it's designed to give you all the time in the world that you could need. It's ample time for everyone, and that's the way I designed it. And I want you to look at your notes, I want you to look at your book. The only thing on the quiz, and think about this, is the quiz has got to be your own work. You don't take your quiz together, right? But you are welcome to use your notes. You're welcome to use the PowerPoints. Right? Open book, open note. The four processes capable of giving behavior strength and purpose is energy and direction. Okay? Would there be a quiz question that might have something to do with energy and direction? What do you think? I mean, if it's a basic, in some likelihood that might be something you'll need. So, there's needs that we can look at. Cognition, emotions, and external events. And these all then carry with them their own motivational potential. So motivation is a multi-sourced phenomenon. It doesn't come from a single area, and it doesn't come at us in a single way. The relationship of motivation and emotion I find absolutely fascinating. So, hierarchy of the four sources of motivation. Well, internal motives we can label as the first three. That is needs, and these might be biological needs, but in a later chapter we're going to separate these. So we're going to talk about all these different aspects of motivation. Cognition is thought, right? In this context, an emotion is the experiential phenomenon, that visceral experience to a certain extent. I'll tell you what's harder to define than motivation, though. Yeah, is emotion. And if you take Psych of emotion, one of the last questions you have to answer is, what is motivation? You have to define that, right, at the end of the course. Now, the external motives, these are forces that operate on us externally, can cause us to engage in behavior. They can determine the direction of our behavior and the amount of energy we devote towards that behavior. So external motives. And that's red meat for a social psychologist. We love to think about the power of the situation. That is, and how it creates these external motives. So, measuring motivation, well, we can observe behavior, and I'm going to flesh each one of these out as we go through them. Engagement, brain and physiological activation, so we can actually look at it that way as well. And think about cognitive neuroscience is the bomb right now, and it's a hot area in psychology. So neuroscience, boy, this is where the money, the attention is being invested right now. So, behavioral expression then, let's just go with the first one. What do we see? Well, we can measure a person's attention, and we would believe that there's more interest or more motivation to the extent that they're paying greater attention. Okay? More effort. So effort is a really good indicator of motivation. See, the thing is, when we want to measure these things in the laboratory, motivation is this theoretical construct. We have to then parse out the observable phenomenon that we suggest are indicators of emotion. Latency, to the extent that someone begins to act, right? Persistence, how long will they continue, and often in the face of adversity. Choice, and to what extent do they choose an activity versus not. And choice has an interesting relationship with motivation. In many of my higher level classes, there are assignments where students get a choice, maybe a choice of the book they want to use, etc. Because if someone has made the choice, then it usually indicates or leads to a higher level of motivation. Probability of response, right? Facial expressions can be another measure of this. So these are all ways to, in fact, measure motivation, especially in a laboratory setting. Now, we as naive psychologists, and when I say that I don't mean it as an insult, naive psychology is the psychology we do day in and day out with ourselves and with all those around us. Scientific psychology is what we do in the laboratory or in constrained field studies, right? But we attend to these things quite often in our interactions with other people or our exploration of ourselves. So, in understanding the behavioral aspect of emotion, these can be useful measures. Now, for interrelated aspects of engagement, right, that was the second component. Behavioral engagement, that is, we can actually observe, right, attention, effort, and persistence. We can look at emotional engagement, interest, enjoyment, the reduction of anger, low frustration. Cognitive engagement, that is sophisticated learning strategies or active self-regulation. So we know that people who are more motivated to accomplish goals in an academic setting, right, will study longer, will monitor their study habits, will think about and compare different study strategies for their effectiveness, all in an effort to increase their ability for self-regulation. And we're going to talk a lot about self-regulation in this class. And then voice, and offer suggestions, make contributions, ask questions. One of the things that I did when I was an undergraduate, it became obvious to me really quickly that I was going to need letters of recommendation. I was going to have to work in a laboratory. I wanted to apply to graduate school. I was going to have to develop relationships with instructors. One thing I did right off the bat is before class, and I mean like in the 3 to 5 minutes before class, I would look at my notes from the last class. And I always went to class. I mean, that's that persistent behavior. But I would always look at my notes, and I would scan the notes and then develop a question. And what does a teacher typically do at the beginning of class? They say, does anyone have any questions about the last class session's materials? And then reliably my hand would pop up, and I would ask a question, right? It's a demonstration of motivation. I want to develop a relationship with these professors. I want to be distinctive in their eyes. I want to go to them and ask a letter of recommendation. And when I went and asked Roxy Silver, Dr. Silver, for a letter of recommendation, she was teaching social psychology in a big lecture class, 150 students in that class. And I said, I know we never had a chance to be formally introduced, but I'm so-and-so, and I was wondering if maybe I could ask you for a letter of recommendation. She was my third letter. The other two professors that I got letters from, I had worked in their laboratories. I needed that third. And Roxy looked at me and she said, you're the guy who sat in the back, right? And I said, yeah, I love sitting in the back. And she said, and you always had a question at the beginning of class, didn't you? And I said, sure did. And she said, I'd be happy to write you a letter. So note that this is energy and direction. I knew my direction. I was motivated to go to graduate school, and I was going to expend the energy to get my ass there. Right? So let's look at the brain and physiological activity as expressions of motivation. This was the third component of the four. Brain activity, right? Activation of brain structures such as the amygdala in fear, or prefrontal cortex in setting goals. So the brain physically is involved in these. The hormonal activity, right? Chemicals in saliva or blood can indicate motivational states. Especially there's been a lot of research on cortisol in this regard. Cardiovascular activity, right? So we can measure motivation, at least arousal, if we want to call that motivation, via cardiovascular activity. Ocular activity, we can watch eyes. Gaze duration, right? Infants, one of the measures of infant attention is gaze duration. Infants, when they're motivated to look at something, when they want to look at something, they look at it longer. When they're disinterested, that is not motivated to look at it, they look away. I know, this seems pretty simple, but it's another way to look at it. Electrodermal activity, we can look at changes of the surface of the skin. Galvanic skin response is another way that's stated, that's associated to perspiration. And then skeletal activity. We can look at musculature, facial expressions. We can look at body language, right? And the desire to leave then, or the desire to not listen to something that someone is saying. I'm motivated to resist your persuasive message, and you know this because I'm crossing my arms. That is shutting it off, right? I'm closing myself off. So we can see then that would be a physical indicator that someone is motivated to not listen, to not accept, to not go along with. So, themes, assumptions in the study of motivation. Well, motivation benefits adaptation. That is, if we were not motivated, then we would just be lumps on the couch, never getting off. So, and notice, this is called assumptions. These are theoretical assumptions. They're supported. Well, let's create some hypotheses and let's test them and figure it out. Okay? So what else do we have? Motives affect behavior by directing attention. Well, okay, that's probably a pretty solid theoretical stance, and we can demonstrate that in the laboratory. Right? Motive strengths vary over time and influence the stream of behavior. That is, motivation is not always consistent. All right? I told you I've been working out like 6 days a week. Well, there's 2 days, like the first and the second, I didn't work out at all. So that was a deviation from my standard practice. But we know that motivation levels can vary, and some days we get up and we just say, no, I don't think I want to do that, or I can't. Right? There's types of motivation that exist. So this is another assumption, a thematic assumption, that there are different types, and we'll explore that throughout the course. Right? Motivation study reveals the contests of human nature. And this is a fascinating idea, and brings to mind kind of also the importance or the role of competition between species members. Okay. To flourish, motivation needs supportive conditions. And this is another assumption, and we see this. How many of you have gone and gotten a job and you were highly motivated when you got there, but your boss is a jerk, or the system under which you're operating is punitive or non-supportive, and you watch your motivation just dwindle over time to the fact that you don't want to even work there anymore, right? There's nothing so practical as a good theory. And thank you, Kurt Lewin. Kurt Lewin was one of the fathers of social psychology, and this was basically his statement. There's nothing so important as a good theory. Theory guides our thinking, theory allows us to check our thinking, and theory generates myriad hypotheses. Questions? I know. I hate asking questions, but it's standard. How many of you want to be back in the classroom in the fall? Oh my God, I so hope. I mean, I'm ready to get my frickin' vaccine. I want my COVID vaccine, both of them. I want to get back in the classroom. I miss you guys so much, right? Being with you is the bomb. Being with you is what, like I said earlier, allows me to enter into that state of flow, right? Now, motives vary over time, right? So this is our fourth component, and it's the ongoing stream of behavior, right? So how do motives influence behavior for students sitting at a desk, right? Well, it's time to study, all right? What is the environmental event? Oh, look, there's a book. Motive aroused, maybe interest, and then what is the relevant course of action, right, is then read the chapter. Now, the motive's urgency, that is to the extent the motive that compels us or controls us, might be pretty low in this regard, right? Now, I love music, and one thing I also miss is at the beginning of class, every class, I play music at the beginning of class, right? And then when the clock strikes, hey, it's time to start. The music ends, and we get busy. But I love music, and prog rock, progressive rock. I just got a book on prog rock over the holidays. Oh my God, it's so good. Now, when that book arrived, right, it's like, man, I ripped that thing open. Here's my book, and I sit down and I start reading it immediately. The interest was super high. Motive was urgent, right? It wasn't a 1 star or 1 asterisk. It was probably a 3 or 4 asterisk. But cola. So here's an environmental event. There's a cola. I'm thirsty. I drink the beverage, right? Familiar voices. This might then arouse my affiliation motive. Okay, so I hope, and as we go into part 2 here, that you see that the environmental event, right, has the potential to arouse a motive, and then from there leads to a relevant action and can vary in its intensity. Let's take a look at this then. This chart is really just describing three different motives, let's say motive X, Y, and Z, and notice the motives, each motive fluctuates in its intensity over time. That is the strength of the motive. What we would say, all else being equal, that we're going to observe X, behavior X, when motive X is at its highest, that is above the other motives. So, I mean, it's kind of a simple diagram. Take-home point, motivations vary according to environmental stimulus, and the explanatory power of a motive can't really be taken away from environmental influences. So does this all sound complicated? It is. It's damn complicated. Multiple motives can exist simultaneously, right? They can compete or cooperate to initiate or inhibit action. And notice motivation can be motivation to stop, but it can be motivation to start, as something we discussed in part one. So understanding how these work, and especially understanding in ourselves, or especially people that are important to us, close to us, if we're careful, if we think in terms of multiple motivations can exist, if we can kind of embrace the complexity of kind of sussing it all out, it's really kind of cool. That is for you, like me, that loves psychology and just can't leave the shit alone, right? So framework to understand motivation, what do we need to kind of figure out? Well, what's the antecedent condition? What's the setup? And this is the person's internal state as well as their external situation, right? And that's going to tell us probably about the motive status, whether this motive is going to be a particularly high intensity given the environmental circumstances and the internal state of the person, the motive status. And the motive status is related to the person's current needs, cognition, or emotion, as we described earlier. So we're going to continue to return to those concepts as determinants of motive status. Now, sense of wanting to, the urge to approach or avoid, is kind of the result of that motive status. Boy, I'm hungry, so I want to move towards food, right? Or, oh my God, I'm full, I push the plate away, right? So, now, energizing and directing, our ultimate kind of explanation there, behavior, engagement, physiology, and the one that we haven't talked a lot about is self-report. And self-report is useful on the one hand, but also can be misleading on the other to at least experimental social psychologists, among others. So, using motivational theories to solve practical problems, and maybe that's where many of you really want to take this. And I'm all about practical application of psychology. Look, I teach organizational psychology and I teach personnel psychology as well. Right? And shameless self-promotion, here's a little commercial. Organizational psychology, if you're interested, in the fall. Personnel scientific personnel selection, personnel psychology in the spring, right? So I'm about using this not just to fascinate us, you know, and our knowledge of psychology, but also to practical purposes. So we take a practical problem, student dropout, mediocre performance. What's up with this, right? Why do some students drop out? What causes some students to display half-assed performance rather than doing a great job, right? Well, that's a practical problem. Now, given what I know about human motivation and emotion, and this is the course, right? This is to build your motivational understanding toolkit. Boy, look at all these possible explanations I've learned. Which one applies in this situation? And that's the step towards providing a practical solution. So the theories guide the big picture, but empirical findings then support or refute the theoretical stances. We combine this with our practical experience. right? And no one should deny practical experience, but no one should rely solely on practical experience either. Empirical findings, right, really flesh it out. So then the proposed solution or intervention, if any, that can be made, right, is the result of this. And do I have a strong reason to believe my proposed intervention will produce positive benefits? What has been done in the past, and that's personal experience and empirical findings, and how does it fit with theory? And obviously when we're designing interventions, ultimately we probably want to subscribe to the philosophy of do no harm. So framing the practical the practical problem, understanding the motivational agent, we ask, what is the phenomenon? So what have we observed? Or what are we looking to change, right? And then it's also important to know what is its opposite. So, and this is something that I'm going to ask you throughout the course is, for example, what is something that you do with no urging and no effort? That is, motivationally, you just, man, I just do this. I just do it, right? And what's another thing that you have to force yourself to do? It's almost like pulling your own teeth out to get yourself to do it, right? That's when I'm talking in terms of opposite. It's very instructive. Why do I do this so effortlessly without urging or prompting? Why do I eagerly approach this? And why do I have to be forced to do this, right? What is the difference? And I think that's a fascinating question, and a question that allows us to learn a lot about ourselves. So, where does it come from? This desire to do it, or this desire to avoid it, right? Is this process malleable or fixed? Can it be changed, or is this the way it's always going to be? And most of us want to hope, that it's amenable to change. And then, what does it relate to, or what does it predict? Okay, so now, then, if we look at this, let's then just go ahead and do it, right? So, let's do it. Turn inward. And notice, this has been adapted for online because this usually says turn to your neighbor in class. But turn inward, right, and consider, maybe even keep a journal of your experience in this course so that you can make real what you're learning, right? Make it part of the story of you, right? And you're going to need this for homework 1 that comes up in the next lecture. Okay, so consider that. Take a moment to do this. Honest to God, yeah. And if you're not motivated to do this, you say, I don't want to do this. Then I want to know, or I don't want to know, but, well, maybe I do, but you want to know, then why, right? What is the phenomenon? What is its opposite? Where does it come from, right? So the theoretical understanding of the problem to be solved is the theory, set of variables, right? And a specification, how they relate to each other. So why does it work? How does it work? Draw a diagram. You can visualize and share. How does it change? What causes it to change? Under what conditions does it change? So if I'm looking and it's time to study, right? What makes me study? What makes me want to avoid study? How does it change? Under what circumstances am I more inclined to want to study or more resistant to studying, right? Yesterday, I wanted to get some work done, but I'll tell you what, I had a real hard time getting any work done because I got gripped by watching people, insurrectionists, but to take over the capital of the United States. I just couldn't force myself to work. I tried. I was trying to write some assignments for Psych and Law, and I just couldn't get my head there, right? As much as I wanted to, the distraction was too compelling, right? So under what conditions? If I'd been quiet, if I didn't have the news on, if I wasn't on Twitter, if I didn't know what the hell was going on, I probably would have banged out another 2 assignments. But considering all these environmental distractions, which I believe are important to witness and understand, or attempt to understand, it interfered, right? X, Y, motivational components. So, where do high and low levels come from? Okay. Well, I'm hoping that this provides us a reasonable overview for the course, right? So this is our introductory process, right? So, but before we finish up, I want you to list 5 motivational issues you have, and this is why maybe you want to keep a journal for the course, right? And these days it's easy because you just put a file on your computer and you're good to go. That is, problems you have with motivation. Then list 5 activities where motivations seem to occur naturally, almost without effort. And notice, this is exactly what I was talking about just like 2 minutes ago. understand, why are some things effortless? Why are some things almost impossible? Make those two lists, and we can start to learn about ourselves, because how does this differ from that? What are the antecedents, right? What is going on with that? And keep those, and let's consider the differences as we move throughout the course. So coming up next, right, we're going to talk a little bit of history, the history of motivation. I know it's not everyone's favorite, but Cracker, you can see she's not too interested either, and poor Cracker. Cracker passed away a little over a year ago, and she was my familiar. So Cracker and I were pretty tight. And I still mourn the loss of Cracker, but she was a crazy cat, an intense friend, and a close friend. So there's Cracker, and adios, Cracker. Right, you guys. I hope that you're at least minorly intrigued. I've attracted your attention, and we're going to move through this course. Lots of work ahead of us. Remember, most of your work is going to be done in small groups, so you're going to have to facilitate your own communication abilities. We'll talk more about that, especially in the next lecture when we get to our first homework assignment. And Penelope has shown up. Penelope's our regular, so Penelope, say goodbye to everybody. All right, you guys. Take care. And I'll see you for lecture 2.